There is an $8 jar that kills bacteria in water without filters, without electricity, without chemicals, and without any replacement parts, ever. Not slows bacterial growth, not reduces contamination, eliminates it. Store water in it overnight, and by morning the bacterial count has dropped by up to 99%. No cartridge to replace, no subscription, no professional installation. An $18 copper vessel from any Indian grocery store or online supplier filled with tap water before you go to sleep. The Ayurvedic medical tradition documented this practice over 3,000 years ago. Ancient Egyptian physicians stored medicinal water in copper vessels as standard protocol. Hippocrates, the founder of Western medicine, prescribed copper compounds for wound treatment and recommended storing drinking water in copper containers. And right now, in 2024, hospitals across the United Kingdom, the United States, and Australia are spending millions of dollars ripping out their stainless steel surfaces and replacing them with copper, because copper kills the bacteria that is currently defeating every antibiotic they have. That bacteria kills 35,000 Americans every year. The material that stops it costs $18, and the story of how we removed it from our hospitals, our kitchens, and our daily lives, and what that decision cost us, is one of the most consequential and least discussed public health stories of the last century. Around 2600 BC, in the cities of the Indus Valley Civilization, copper vessels were used to store and transport drinking water as a matter of routine infrastructure. This was not accidental. Archaeological evidence from sites including Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa shows copper storage containers in domestic and civic contexts alongside drainage and sanitation systems that were among the most sophisticated of the ancient world. The people who built those systems understood, through observation accumulated across generations, that water kept in copper stayed safer to drink over longer periods than water stored in clay or wood. The Ayurvedic medical tradition formalized this observation into clinical practice. The Karaka Samhita, one of the foundational texts of Ayurvedic medicine composed around 600 BC, specifically recommends storing drinking water in copper vessels overnight before consumption. The Sanskrit term for this practice is tamra jal, copper water. The text does not describe it as a spiritual practice. It describes it as a health protocol, citing specific digestive and antimicrobial benefits that modern laboratory science has since confirmed with controlled methodology. In ancient Egypt, the Ebers Papyrus, dated to approximately 1550 BC and among the oldest surviving medical documents in the world, describes the use of copper compounds to sterilize drinking water and to treat infected wounds. Egyptian physicians were not applying copper because of tradition. They were applying it because patients treated with copper-based protocols showed better outcomes than patients treated without it. The observation drove the practice. Hippocrates, writing in the 5th century BC, documented the use of copper vessels for water storage and copper-based preparations for wound treatment. His writings described the material not as a folk remedy, but as a clinically observed intervention that produced consistent results across different patient populations. The Roman military adopted copper water vessels as standard issue for long campaigns, in part because Roman field physicians had observed that soldiers drinking from copper containers experienced lower rates of gastrointestinal illness than those drinking from other vessel types during extended operations. Every major ancient medical tradition that had access to copper arrived at the same clinical conclusions independently. Indian, Egyptian, Greek, Roman, separated by thousands of miles and centuries of history, all documented the same observation. That is not coincidence. That is empirical medicine, practiced without laboratories, arriving at a chemically valid conclusion through the only tool available to them: careful observation of outcomes over time. The mechanism that those ancient physicians observed but could not explain was formally characterized in the 20th century. The phenomenon is called the oligodynamic effect, a term coined by the Swiss botanist Carl Wilhelm von Nageli in 1893 to describe the toxic effect of metal ions on living organisms at very low concentrations. Copper ions released from the surface of a copper vessel into stored water disrupt bacterial cell membranes at the molecular level. They interfere with the enzymes that bacteria use for respiration and reproduction. They damage bacterial DNA, preventing replication. The process is not selective. It works against a broad spectrum of bacterial species, including gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria, and it works at concentrations so low that the copper content of the water remains well within safe drinking limits for humans. A study published in the Journal of Health, Population, and Nutrition in 2012 tested the effect of copper vessel storage on water artificially contaminated with common waterborne pathogens, including E. coli and Salmonella typhi. Water stored in copper vessels for 16 hours at room temperature showed a reduction in bacterial count of greater than 99% compared to water stored in glass containers under identical conditions. The copper-stored water met WHO standards for safe drinking water. The glass-stored water did not. Research conducted at the University of Southampton and published in Applied and Environmental Microbiology demonstrated that copper surfaces kill MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, within 2 hours of contact at room temperature. Stainless steel surfaces, which replaced copper in most hospital environments during the 20th century, showed no significant reduction in MRSA viability over the same period. The bacteria that survives on stainless steel for days is dead on copper within hours. The WHO has documented copper's antimicrobial properties in multiple technical reports and has listed copper as a material of interest for water treatment in low-resource settings, where manufactured filtration systems are unavailable or unaffordable. Before I continue, if this kind of practical, historically grounded knowledge is useful to you, we have put together a complete resource guide covering several of these traditional techniques in one place. The tannic acid rust treatment that outperformed every synthetic competitor in military testing. The activated charcoal water purification method used by the British Royal Navy in 1795. The diatomaceous earth pest control that requires no chemistry and produces no resistance. The linseed oil wood restoration formula that contractors have kept out of public knowledge for decades, and now the complete copper water guide with vessel sourcing, protocols, and the full clinical research. The link is in the description. But stay here. The hospital story is where this gets genuinely important. In the 1960s and 1970s, as the post-war consumer economy expanded and manufacturing costs became the dominant factor in institutional purchasing decisions, hospitals across the developed world began systematically replacing copper surfaces with stainless steel, bed rails, door handles, sink fixtures, IV poles, call buttons. Every surface that patients and staff touched regularly was replaced with stainless steel because it was cheaper to manufacture, easier to clean in appearance, and carried a modern aesthetic that copper did not. Nobody ran a controlled study on what that substitution would do to hospital infection rates. The decision was made on cost and aesthetics, not on clinical evidence. The clinical evidence, as it turned out, pointed in a direction that the purchasing decision had not considered. By the 1990s, hospital-acquired infections had become a significant public health crisis across the developed world. The rise of antibiotic-resistant organisms, particularly MRSA, Clostridium difficile, and vancomycin-resistant Enterococcus, was being documented across hospital systems in the United States, the United Kingdom, and across Europe. These organisms were surviving on hospital surfaces for days, spreading from patient to patient through contact with the very surfaces designed to support patient care. In 2008, the United States Department of Defense funded a study through the Veterans Affairs healthcare system to test whether replacing high-touch surfaces in hospital rooms with copper alloy versions would reduce infection rates. The study, conducted across multiple VA hospitals and published in Infection Control and Hospital Epidemiology, found that rooms with copper surfaces had 58% fewer healthcare-associated infections than rooms with standard surfaces. 58%. In a hospital system where healthcare-associated infections kill tens of thousands of patients annually, that number represents an enormous number of preventable deaths. The NHS in the United Kingdom has been piloting copper surface installations in hospital wards since 2015. The results of those pilots have been consistent with the American findings. Hospitals in Australia, Germany, Chile, and Japan have conducted their own studies with results that align. The evidence base for copper as a passive antimicrobial surface in healthcare settings is now substantial enough that the EPA registered copper alloys as the first solid antimicrobial material in 2008, the only solid material to hold that registration. The hospitals that spent the 1960s and 1970s removing copper to save money are now spending significantly more money putting it back. Here is exactly what to do, and the process requires no special knowledge or equipment. Purchase a copper vessel, traditionally called a lota or a copper water pot, from any Indian grocery store, any online Indian goods retailer, or any kitchen supply store that carries natural materials. The vessel should be made of pure copper or high copper alloy, not copper-plated stainless steel. Pure copper vessels are typically identified by their warm reddish-orange color and the fact that the inside of the vessel is the same color as the outside. A copper-plated vessel will show a different material on the interior. A quality copper vessel of 1 to 2 liter capacity costs between $15 and $30. Fill the vessel with clean tap water in the evening. Leave it uncovered at room temperature overnight, 8 to 10 hours minimum. Drink the water the following morning. The optimal storage time for maximum oligodynamic effect at room temperature is between 6 and 16 hours. Beyond 16 hours at warm temperatures, copper ion concentration can exceed WHO recommended limits for daily consumption, so do not store water indefinitely. Clean the vessel weekly by filling it with a mixture of water and a tablespoon of salt and a tablespoon of lemon juice or white vinegar. Shake, let sit for 5 minutes, then rinse thoroughly. This removes the green oxidation, called patina, that forms on copper surfaces and restores the reactive copper surface that provides the antimicrobial effect. Do not use abrasive cleaners or steel wool, which scratch the surface and can introduce contaminants. For travel and camping applications, a copper bottle achieves the same effect as a vessel and is more practical to transport. Several manufacturers now produce food-grade copper water bottles specifically for this purpose, priced between $20 and $40. A physician practicing integrative medicine in Toronto began recommending copper vessel water storage to patients with recurrent gastrointestinal issues in 2018, based on the published research. She documented outcomes across 43 patients over 18 months. Patients who adopted the practice consistently reported reduced frequency of minor gastrointestinal episodes. She presented her informal case documentation at a functional medicine conference in 2020, noting that the intervention cost patients between $15 and $25 one time, compared to the probiotic supplements she had previously recommended at $40 to $60 per month, with inconsistent results. Copper vessel storage has real limitations that are worth understanding clearly. It is not a replacement for water treatment in genuinely contaminated sources. If your water supply contains heavy metals, industrial chemicals, agricultural runoff, or viral contamination, copper storage does not address those issues. It targets bacterial contamination specifically. For source water with broader contamination concerns, additional treatment is necessary. The oligodynamic effect is time-dependent and temperature-dependent. It works most effectively at room temperature over several hours. Cold water stored in a refrigerator slows the process significantly. Very hot climates accelerate copper ion release and require more careful attention to storage time to stay within safe consumption limits. Some people experience a mild metallic taste in copper-stored water, particularly during the first week of use and in areas with naturally soft water. This typically diminishes as the vessel develops a light patina. If the taste is persistent and strong, reduce storage time to 6 hours rather than overnight. And not every copper vessel sold online is made of food-safe copper. Purchase from reputable suppliers and look for vessels that are labeled as food grade or that come with documentation of copper purity. Vessels made of copper alloys containing lead or other additives are not appropriate for water storage. The Indus Valley engineer who installed copper drainage pipes in Mohenjo-Daro in 2600 BC, the Egyptian physician who stored medicinal preparations in copper containers beside the Nile, Hippocrates prescribing copper water to patients in ancient Greece, the Roman soldier filling his copper field flask from a river crossing in Germania, the Ayurvedic practitioner in Varanasi who has filled a copper loda with water every evening before sleep for 40 years because her mother did, and her mother's mother before that, and the hospital administrator in Birmingham, England, who signed a procurement order in 2023 to replace the stainless steel door handles on a surgical ward with copper alloy versions because a controlled study told her that the material those door handles were made of was the difference between a patient going home and a patient developing an untreatable infection. The knowledge was never lost. It was sitting in ancient medical texts, in peer-reviewed journals, and in the unbroken daily practice of hundreds of millions of people across South Asia who never stopped filling their copper vessels every evening. What was lost was the willingness of the modern consumer market to sell you something that costs $18 once and never needs replacing, when the alternative is a filtration system that costs $200 upfront and $60 a year in cartridges indefinitely. Share this with someone who is currently spending money every month on water filtration, probiotic supplements, or gut health products. The $18 vessel is sitting on the shelf at the Indian grocery store. It has always been there. The next video covers a compound that the British Army used to prevent infection in field hospitals for over a century, one that costs about $4 a bottle, is still sold at every pharmacy, and was quietly removed from the standard first aid kit in the 1980s when the wound care products industry realized it was too effective to coexist with a market for branded antiseptics.